They sued my farm over dust. That's really how this whole thing started. And if you'd told me a year earlier that a little gravel dust in rural Missouri would end with an entire luxury subdivision trapped behind walls of steaming manure and a six-figure settlement wired into my account, I probably would have laughed and asked what you'd been drinking. But that's exactly what happened. My name's Ethan Calloway. I'm 46 years old, and I farm the same stretch of land outside Boone County my family's held since 1911, back when my great-granddad came here with a mule, 2 shovels, and enough stubbornness to turn wild prairie into something worth passing down. We grow corn and soybeans mostly, some wheat when the season makes sense, and the farmhouse still sits where it always has, white paint peeling a little on the south porch, old cedar trees bending when the wind comes hard, and a grain silo standing silver against the sky, like it's keeping watch over all of it. The road that cuts through the middle matters more than most people would guess. It's gravel, about half a mile long, straight through the property and out toward County Route D. It's private land. Always has been. My dad allowed access decades ago because back then neighbors still borrowed fence posts and helped pull each other's trucks out of ditches, and nobody needed contracts for every little thing. Then in 2020 they built Silver Creek Estates on the east side, where cattle pasture used to be. 72 oversized homes, all fresh white siding, black trim, immaculate driveways, polished mailboxes, every one of them looking like they'd been copied and pasted. Expensive too. Folks from Kansas City mostly. Remote workers, realtors, investment people. Nice enough at first. A few waved when they drove by. Some kids rode bikes down the gravel. I didn't mind any of it. Land changes. That's life. But one person made herself impossible to ignore. Vanessa Mercer, 49. President of the HOA before the last house was even finished. Sharp voice, perfect teeth, always in pressed clothes like she was headed to court or a photo shoot. Drove a pearl-white Range Rover and somehow always looked annoyed, like the world kept failing to match her expectations. The first run-in was over my combine kicking dust during harvest. She parked at the end of my lane and waited till I shut the engine down, heels sinking into the gravel, while she smiled that kind of smile that isn't really smiling. She said, "Mr. Calloway, residents are concerned. The dust drifts onto our patios." I told her harvest creates dust. Same as rain creates mud. She didn't laugh, just stared like she was measuring how hard I'd be to move. After that came emails. Complaints about tractor noise. Complaints about fertilizer smell. Complaints about equipment crossing during commuter hours. My favorite was a letter saying my grain dryer negatively impacted the luxury aesthetic of the neighborhood. I ignored most of it. Figured eventually they'd settle in and realize farms don't operate on HOA calendars. Then one Tuesday morning in April, I came in from checking irrigation lines and found an overnight envelope on the kitchen table. Certified legal notice. Lawsuit filed in county court. Vanessa Mercer representing Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association, claiming agricultural dust was reducing air quality, affecting home values, obstructing resident access, and creating an ongoing nuisance. They wanted damages, $1.2 million, plus an injunction restricting all heavy equipment operation from 7 in the morning until 7 at night, which, for a working farm in spring, is basically another way of saying shut it down and lose the year. I sat there at my kitchen table staring at the papers while coffee went cold beside me, and for a minute I honestly couldn't believe it. My dad used to say some people move next to farmland and expect a golf course. I guess he was right. But what got under my skin wasn't even the money. It was the arrogance. The assumption that because they built bigger houses and carried legal folders and wore expensive watches, somehow a 100-year-old farm needed their permission to exist. I went into Dad's old office off the mudroom, where we still keep deed records and tax files and receipts going back decades in steel cabinets. Took me 45 minutes to find the easement paperwork from 1986. Yellowed paper. Original county seal. Signed by my father. I read every line twice. Then once more. Access granted by owner. Revocable at owner discretion. No compensation required. No permanent access guarantee. I leaned back in that old chair and laughed out loud. Not because it was funny exactly. More because I could suddenly see the whole thing clear as daylight. They had one road. One way in. One way out. And legally, it was still mine. That evening I stood by the mailbox when Vanessa drove through and flagged her down. She lowered the window halfway. I held up the easement copy. You sure you want to do this? I asked. She looked at the paper like it was meaningless and gave me this little shrug. Our attorneys are very confident. Then she smiled. Maybe farming here just isn't practical anymore. And that right there did it. Something cold settled in my chest. My granddad buried his dog under that cottonwood tree behind the barn. My dad rebuilt the north field after the flood in '93 with his own hands. My son learned to drive a tractor on that road. And this woman in a Range Rover thought she could pressure us off because dust landed on patio furniture. By sunrise next morning, I was on the phone with a contractor I'd known 20 years, and by lunch the first trucks were already rumbling up the west entrance loaded heavy enough to shake the windows. And when the people in Silver Creek looked outside and saw what was rolling toward their only road, that's when everything really began. By noon there were 12 trucks lined up along the fence row, diesel engines idling, trailers piled high with aged cattle manure from a nearby operation outside Columbia, dark and steaming in the spring sun, and my buddy Rick Dalton from Dalton Earthworks climbed down from the cab grinning like he already knew this would become county legend. Rick looked at the subdivision, looked back at me, then said, "You absolutely sure?" I folded the easement paperwork and slid it into my back pocket. "Every inch stays on my property," I told him, "and every inch stays legal." He tipped his hat and got moving. We started with steel livestock panels anchored down both sides of the gravel easement, leaving the actual roadway untouched, but boxing it in tight. Then the loaders came through and packed manure behind the panels, layer after layer, until both walls stood almost 8 feet high. Long dark ridges stretching the entire length of that road, like somebody had built a fortress out of a feedlot. I'll be honest, even I had to stop and stare once it took shape. It looked ridiculous. It looked insane. It also happened to be perfectly within county agricultural zoning. Nothing touched the lane itself. Residents still had access. No gates. No blockades. No interference. Just 72 homeowners driving through what smelled like the inside of a cattle barn in July. By 5:30 the first commuters started coming home. A Tesla rolled in slow with windows shut tight. Then an Escalade. Then a minivan. Every vehicle creeping between those walls, while warm spring air trapped the smell right down into the lane. A teenage kid on a bike actually turned around halfway and went back the other direction, covering his nose with his shirt. I was standing near the grain bins with a bottle of water trying not to laugh when Vanessa's Range Rover came tearing down the drive. She slammed on the brakes hard enough to throw gravel. Jumped out before the engine even shut off. "What in God's name is this?" she snapped. I took another sip of water and said, "Fertilizer storage. This is harassment." "Actually," I said, "this is agriculture." Her face went bright red. "Residents are sick. Roads open. The smell is unbearable." "Farm country," I said. "That happens." She took a step closer and lowered her voice. "You think this is funny?" And for a second I could see something different in her, not just anger, but panic. Because she finally understood the balance had shifted. Lawsuits feel powerful when they're filed from climate-controlled offices. They feel a lot shakier standing beside 800 yards of steaming manure. I reached into my truck and handed her a folder. "What's this?" she asked. "A proposal." She opened it right there. The top page laid out retroactive access fees dating back 26 years based on private easement valuation, maintenance use, increased wear, liability exposure, and agricultural disruption. Total due, $9.6 million. Below that was option 2, a fresh agreement, $750,000 up front. Monthly road use fee. Speed limit capped at 15. Owner reserves temporary closure rights with notice. Penalties for violations. Vanessa stared at the paper like she'd misread it. Then she laughed once, sharp and bitter. "You cannot be serious." "Completely serious. This is extortion." "No," I said. "That lawsuit was extortion. This is paperwork." She crumpled the corner of the page and stormed back to her SUV. By the next morning things escalated fast. The subdivision Facebook page apparently exploded overnight. One resident posted a video from inside their Lexus driving through the tunnel while kids screamed, laughing and gagging at the same time. Another posted complaints about the smell lingering in garages. Delivery drivers started hesitating before entering. A landscaping company refused service until air quality conditions improved. Somebody from county sanitation drove out after an anonymous complaint, walked the full easement, checked boundaries, then told me everything looked compliant and left. That made Vanessa furious. She came back the second evening with an attorney this time, some guy in polished loafers sweating through his collar before he even reached the porch. He launched into legal threats, nuisance claims, emotional distress, temporary injunction. Rick happened to be leaning against my truck eating sunflower seeds and muttered loud enough for all of us. Funny how folks can smell money from a mile away, but manure's the problem. I nearly lost it. Vanessa ignored him and said if I didn't remove the walls immediately they'd seek emergency action. I asked if they planned to continue suing over dust. She hesitated. Then the attorney answered for her. The HOA intends to protect property values. Then so do I said. Mine just happened to be here first. They left empty-handed. And by Friday the market started talking. The first house listed. Then another. A realtor friend in town texted me that buyers were backing out of contracts after hearing about the road situation. Appraisal chatter spread quick. Silver Creek values started slipping. Not because the neighborhood was bad, but because nobody buying a $600,000 home wants to explain why guests have to drive through what smells like a ranch yard to visit. Saturday afternoon I saw something I genuinely didn't expect. A moving truck parked outside Vanessa Mercer's house. Not her leaving, but her husband loading boxes. Daniel Mercer. Quiet guy. I'd spoken to him maybe twice. Always seemed tired. He caught me watching from across the field and gave the kind of exhausted shrug men give when they're too drained to explain anything. Later Rick heard from somebody in town they'd been fighting nonstop for days. Turns out losing a chunk of your home's appraised value while your neighbors blame you tends to create tension. Monday night Silver Creek held an emergency HOA meeting at their clubhouse. You could hear shouting from halfway across the bean field. Pickup trucks and luxury SUVs packed every parking spot. People pacing outside. Hands flying. Voices raised. I didn't go near it. Didn't need to. Around 10:30 my phone rang. Unknown number. I answered. Older male voice. Calm. Mr. Calloway, this is Thomas Wheeler. I'm the new HOA president. That surprised me. New. He exhaled. Board voted tonight. Vanessa resigned. I leaned back in the porch chair and listened to crickets for a second. And we'd like to talk. Tuesday morning Thomas came alone. No lawyer. No luxury SUV. Just a retired dentist in a windbreaker carrying a legal pad and looking like a man who hadn't slept. We sat at the picnic table under the maple tree. He glanced toward the manure walls, then back at me. People are angry, he admitted. At you? I asked. He actually laughed. Mostly at each other. Then he got serious. The lawsuit was a mistake. I agree. Can we settle this? I slid the updated agreement across the table. Lower than the original. Still expensive. Large upfront payment. Monthly road use. Shared maintenance contribution. My authority to close access with 72 hours notice for harvest or repairs. Clear liability protection. Thomas read every page carefully. Asked 2 questions. Crossed out 1 clause. Added 1 line guaranteeing emergency services access. Fair enough. We shook hands right there. By Thursday afternoon the wire transfer hit my account. $700,000 cleared. Monthly payments scheduled beginning the following month. New recorded easement filed with the county. Binding. Clean. Legal. Final. And Friday morning Rick brought loaders back out. We peeled down the manure walls panel by panel while residents watched from driveways like survivors after a weird natural disaster. Half of them looked relieved. A few looked embarrassed. One older lady waved at me. Another guy in a golf shirt actually yelled, "Worth it," and laughed. The smell faded by sunset. Gravel Road looked like it always had. Quiet. Simple. But the story wasn't finished yet, because later that evening Vanessa Mercer pulled back into Silver Creek one last time, stepped out of that white Range Rover, and came walking straight toward my porch. And judging by the look on her face, she wasn't there to apologize. It was just after sunset when Vanessa came up the porch steps, the sky turning orange behind the grain silo, and the cicadas starting up in the trees. And for the first time since any of this began, she didn't look polished or untouchable or like she had every answer in the room. She looked tired. Not dramatic tired either, real tired. Hair pulled back loose, no blazer, jeans and a plain sweater, standing there with both hands in her pockets like she wasn't completely sure why she'd come, but knew she needed to. I opened the screen door and neither of us said anything for a second. Then she looked out toward the gravel road where the last of the panels had already been hauled off and said, "You really made your point." I leaned against the frame. Wasn't trying to make a point. She gave a dry little laugh. "Come on, Mr. Calloway." "Ethan," I said. And no, I was trying to protect my farm. She nodded slowly and stared out over the field. "When we bought there, I thought we were building something better." "Better than what?" I asked. She hesitated. "The city. Noise. Crowds. Politics. All of it. I wanted peace. I wanted clean air. A neighborhood where things felt controlled." That last word hung there for a second. Controlled. Then she shook her head at herself and smiled like she knew exactly how that sounded. "Guess I spent so much time trying to shape the place into what I thought it should be. I forgot it already was something before we got there." I looked out at the field too. Corn just starting to rise. Dirt my family had spent generations breaking and planting and rebuilding after storms and drought and floods. "That happens more than you'd think," I told her. She looked over at me then, finally direct. I was wrong. And I'll be honest. I didn't expect that. I expected blame. Excuses. Another threat. Not that. She took a breath and added, "The lawsuit was mine. The board followed me. I pushed too hard." I nodded once. "You did. Daniel moved into an apartment in Columbia," she said quietly. "Said he needed a break." There was something sad in that, enough that I didn't say anything for a minute. Then she asked, "Do you regret it?" I thought about the trucks, the smell, the shouting, the wire transfer, my dad's old easement papers sitting folded in the kitchen drawer. I thought about the first moment she told me maybe farming there wasn't practical anymore. And I told her the truth. I regret that it ever got that far. She accepted that. No argument. No comeback. Just nodded and headed back down the porch steps. Halfway to the Range Rover, she stopped and turned around. "For what it's worth, the corn looks beautiful from our side." I smiled a little and said, "That's because it was planted by someone who doesn't ask permission from an HOA." That finally got a laugh out of her, and then she got in and drove off. Haven't had trouble since. Silver Creek still uses the road. Payments still come in every month. Folks wave more now than they used to. Couple of the neighbors even buy sweet corn from us every August, and last fall Thomas Wheeler showed up with his grandkids for pumpkins and spent 20 minutes helping my son stack hay bales. Funny how people can become neighbors the second they stop trying to own everything around them. The farm's still here. Same porch, same gravel, same fields moving with the wind. And every now and then, when somebody new moves into Silver Creek and asks why the easement contract has 12 pages and unusually specific agricultural clauses, one of the longtime residents usually tells them the story. They leave out some details. They always exaggerate others. That's how small-town stories work. But the lesson survives every version. Land remembers who respected it and who tried to control it. And just because somebody arrives with bigger money and louder lawyers doesn't mean they own the ground beneath their tires. Sometimes the oldest thing in the room still has the final say. So I'm curious what you think. Did I go too far building that manure tunnel around their only road out? Or was it the only language that HOA was ever going to understand? If you were standing on that porch with the lawsuit in your hand and 100 years of family land behind you, what would you have done? Let me know in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with neighbors or an HOA trying to push too far, share your story too. Because trust me, around here, the best conversations usually start right after somebody says, "You're not going to believe what happened next."